Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be finishing up the tissues chapter and going over the last couple tissues and then bringing it all together for a little bit for tissue repair and regeneration. So we're going to be talking about nervous tissue, so those are neurons. Then we're going to talk about the three types of muscle tissue, and then how when two tissue types come together, so an epithelial tissue and a connective tissue, forms membranes. And we're going to talk about three important membranes found in our bodies, and then we're going to talk about tissue regeneration and repair. All right, so getting into it quickly right now, the first tissue we're going to talk about here is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is made up of these little neurons here. So a neuron has a cell body. There's the nucleus of this neuron particularly, and then there are all these little dendrites coming out of the neuron. Then from that, there's an axon hillock, and then it follows down an axon to wherever it sends that signal. So neurons are the messengers of the signal senders of our body. When you touch something hot, that's how it tells you you just touched something hot. So they're a very, very important part of our sensations. They direct all of our movements, all of our feelings, and they get about 4 chapters coming up dedicated to them. There are different shapes, sizes, and distances these neurons can travel and communicate, but it's how our body communicates with our surroundings and helps maintain homeostasis within us. But they are considered a type of tissue. There are different kinds of neurons, but we will talk about those in a later chapter. Same with the muscles. So there are 3 types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and then what we'll talk about after this, smooth muscle. Now, these also get their own chapter, the muscle tissues, and when we go over every muscle in the body, we'll be talking about these muscles again as well and how muscle contraction works. The first muscle here is skeletal muscle. This is voluntary. So there are a few key words you want to remember for each muscle type here. So skeletal muscle is voluntary and it is striated. When I'm flapping my arms here, I tell myself to move these muscles. It is voluntary. I decide to do those actions. I control all these muscles. And they have striations. Striations mean they have these little stripes. So there are these little thick and thin filaments, and the way they overlap each other form these striping patterns. And how the contraction works is the sliding filament model for contraction, and we're going to talk about that later. And this striped pattern is essential for a muscle contraction. So voluntary and striated. And also one I didn't mention was multinucleated. So here there's 1, 2, 3, all these dark purple spots. So this is one muscle cell, one muscle fiber. And that's one unique thing about the muscle cells, is that they have this unique shape where they're packed full of these filaments called myofibrils. Those are the thick and thin filaments that are crossing over each other or sliding over each other for a muscle contraction. But they're packed full of those, so this takes lots and lots of energy. So there's lots of nuclei there as well, and lots of mitochondria. All right, so that's skeletal muscle. Next one here is cardiac muscle. So cardiac is heart, of course. So key things with heart. Do you have to tell your heart to beat? I hope not. So the heart is cardiac muscle is termed non-voluntary. It is also striated. Like skeletal, it is striated. So you can see those little striations in here. So it has this actin and myosin thin filaments, and cardiac muscle contracts exactly the same as skeletal muscle for the sliding filament model of contraction. Another thing cardiac muscle has is things called intercalated discs. So, and it also branches. So intercalated discs are gap junctions. When your heart beats as a unit. Every single cardiac cell in your heart beats every single time your heart beats. Skeletal muscle isn't like that. Skeletal muscle, certain muscle fibers are activated while certain ones are relaxing. And cardiac cells are able to contract in unison via these little intercalated discs. So right there is one right there. This is filled with gap junctions. So the important ion here, calcium, can move through. Calcium is essential for muscle contraction, can move through the heart and make it contract as a unit. Another thing that cardiac muscle can do, it can also form little branches with these tissues as well because of these intercalated discs. And the last muscle type here is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is what's lining all your hollow organs, so your small intestines, your stomach. It's located everywhere. The erector pili muscle in your skin that gives you goosebumps that we're going to talk about next chapter in the integumentary system. It's all smooth muscle. So smooth muscle, it acts via your autonomic nervous system. So when your parasympathetic system is activated during rest and digest, it speeds up your digestive capabilities. So this is non-voluntary. You do not have to tell yourself to digest your food. You eat a lot of food, you just end up taking a nap, and your body forces you in a rest or digest. That's the food coma that you get after eating Thanksgiving dinner. It has nothing to do with the tryptophan in a turkey. It's because you just super overate, and you pretty much have a blood sugar spike, and your body puts you to nap so it can digest. And then smooth muscle also lacks striations. So when we get to the muscles, we'll talk about how the myofilaments are arranged slightly different in muscle fiber. Don't take these nuclei being lined up in a regular direction as striations. That's not what striations means. Striations is referring to the direction of the myofibrils. If we were to draw a smooth muscle cell over here, the myofibrils are actually forming this little crisscross network here, and the muscle cell actually bulges as contraction happens and bulges out between these, and there's these little dense bodies in here. So muscle fiber contraction of the smooth muscle is drastically different than skeletal muscle. And we'll talk about that difference later. Just it lacks striations and it's non-voluntary are the key terms for smooth muscle. Okay, we have finally gotten through all the tissues if you'll watch the last 3 parts. So the first part was on the epithelial tissue, then we talked about the connective tissues, and now we just finished it up with the last 2 tissue types here. So now when we put 2 tissues together, we might start forming an organ. Some of these organs are just known as membranes. So that's when you add an epithelial tissue and a connective tissue. Remember, you have your epithelial layer, and then you have your basement membrane, and then you have your connective tissue layer. There are a few unique ones of these that get an appropriate name. The first type here are your mucous membranes. So these line the digestive, respiratory, and your urinary and reproductive tracts. They secrete mucus, so they usually, remember when we talked about the pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelial cells? They produce those goblet cells producing mucus. Some of these produce serous fluids and so forth. And so speaking of the serous fluids, there's another membrane called serous membranes. In the first chapter, we were talking about how the heart and the lungs and the abdominopelvic region is in this cavity. They're called serous, pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity, and the peritoneal cavity. So there's a layer. The analogy I like to use is you put your fist in a water balloon. So you have the water balloon, you put your fist inside it. So then this is a fist right here, trust me. And then there's a membrane that's directly on top of your fist. And then there's a fluid inside the water balloon. And then there's a membrane on the outside. So now think about that when your hand moves. The purpose of these serous membranes is to prevent friction buildup. Your heart is moving a lot. Your lungs are moving a lot. Your intestines are also moving a lot. So this little fluid in here is almost like a lubricating fluid. This is called serous fluid. And then the membrane directly on the organ is called the visceral membrane. So the visceral pericardium is the membrane on the heart, so visceral. And then the membrane on the outside is called the parietal membrane. So visceral, parietal, and then in the middle we have the serous fluid. Again, this is preventing the buildup of friction for movements that move a lot. So lungs, heart, and intestines. So the digestive system down here is called the peritoneal cavity. Lungs are called the pleural cavity, and the heart is called the pericardial cavity. Then next chapter, we're going to be talking about the integumentary system, and the big part of the integumentary system is the skin, which is better known as the cutaneous membrane. Cutaneous membrane has a layer on top called the epidermis. That's stratified squamous connective tissue. And then below it, we have the dermis, which is a mixture of different types of connective tissue between areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. But there's 2 layers that makes up the cutaneous membrane, so the epidermis and the dermis. And then there's even a layer of hypodermis that's sometimes considered underneath, which contains fat. But we'll talk about that way more next chapter when we go over the integumentary system. And then the last little type of membrane here are the synovial membranes. We're going to talk about these when we get to the joints. So joints are movable joints like my elbow, like my shoulder, is within this little membrane encapsulated area where there are synovial membranes which produce synovial fluid into this region. So if I have a joint, an articulation right in here, let's say this is a joint cavity where these two bones move over each other, there's a little membrane in here that seals this cavity off and produces a fluid in this region that lubricates this region and makes it so you don't build up a lot of friction and these two ends don't rub on each other and cause pain. So that's the fluid you have within a lot of your movable joints, but we'll also talk about those later. All right, last little thing I want to talk about this chapter to bring it all together is to talk about tissue repair and the regenerative capacity of some of these different tissues. So first here, the repair mechanisms. Let's say you get a little cut on your skin. So here again is the epidermis layer, and then down here is that dermal layer. So we get a little cut here. The first thing that happens are these little green balls roll into the region. It doesn't really happen like that, but these green things are inflammatory chemicals like histamine. So histamine is an important inflammatory chemical, and it causes inflammation in the region, which allows white blood cells to get out through the capillaries and the veins in the region. You get to the region, macrophages can come there, eat debris, and clotting factors. The most important part here are these clotting factors. They bring in proteins that form a fibrin clot in this region and prevent the loss of blood and also seal it off. You do not want to keep this region open to the environment too long and give microbes an easy way to get to your cardiovascular system. Once they get in the cardiovascular system, it gives them a free ride around the body. So we have to repair this tissue and get it back to normal operating means. And for a little simple example here, like a little cut on our skin, it's not too bad. Release inflammatory chemicals. White blood cells here called neutrophils come to the region, eating all the debris that are formed here. So you have all this broken collagen fiber, all these broken cells. These neutrophils eat it. Next step is then to form this granulation layer. This granulation layer is just collagen fibers that are crisscrossing through the region. And then we start forming new vasculature, regrowing the blood vessels in this region because we need blood back through the dermal layer as well. Macrophages then come in and they start eating the but eating all the cellular debris that are left over there. And then up here we form the scab that is trying to protect that region and allow the granulation to continue beneath it. Last step here is the scab falls off and we want to restore all that tissue, but usually you end up with a scar if the cut is severe enough. Scar tissue forms because you have a crisscrossing of collagen fibers where there usually wasn't a crisscrossing. Although that tissue has restored its normal function, you could just get scar tissue that remains there. And there are ways to limit the amount of scar tissue formation, but especially in surgery, if surgeons follow what are called the tension lines in the body. So in the dermis layer, some of the collagen fibers are running in similar directions. So if the surgeon cuts parallel to those collagen fibers, it heals more readily, has a less chance of having as bad of scars. An enzyme called collagenase also helps break down scar tissue here. So collagenase is an enzyme that eats collagen. All right, and the last little thing I want to talk about is how certain tissues regenerate at certain rates. So tissues could regenerate extremely well. So these include epithelial tissues, bone. So, well, think about epithelial tissues, lining of your stomach. They need to regenerate very, very quickly. As they break down, they usually all have contact inhibition that are allowing them to grow. So epithelial tissue, bone, areolar connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue actually regenerates extremely well because chondrocytes are actually restoring the cartilage from above, even though they are avascular. Usually when you think of something being avascular, you don't think of it regenerating very quickly. And then blood-forming tissue. So you're forming red blood cells, white blood cells at a pretty fast rate. And then moderate regenerating capability includes smooth muscle. So smooth muscle can regenerate moderately well, and also dense regular connective tissue. So that includes like your tendons and stuff. They can regenerate, but if you get a full tendon tear, that typically requires surgery. And then there are two main tissue types that have virtually no regenerative capability. One being your cardiac muscle. So cardiac cells, you get a heart attack, that turns into scar tissue in the heart. Heart no longer beats as efficiently. There is some research trying to activate stem cells to differentiate into cardiac cells. That's still ongoing, but one of the biggest impacts of having a heart attack is that scar tissue formation and part of the heart not working the same as it was before. And then the other one is, well, are your neurons. So your neurons are your central nervous system. If they die, they don't get replaced and regenerate. Now, the neurons in the peripheral nervous system in your arms and stuff, there is a limited regenerative capability if the certain cells that are there called Schwann cells can grow that gap back together, but we'll get to that when we get to the nervous system in anatomy and physiology too. So cardiac and neurons have virtually no functional regenerative capability, not near the regenerative capability of our epithelial tissue. All right, so this was a quick and dirty summary and ending to the tissues chapter. Next, so we went over tissue repair, the membranes, we went over smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and nervous tissue. Next chapter, we're going to be getting into the integumentary system, where we start talking about skin, hair, nail, oil glands, and sweat glands. So I will see you all next time, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.